Racism emerges really in the 16th and 17th, particularly the 17th century. Europeans were enslaving, and had for some centuries been enslaving people both of Africa and of the New World.
The history of racism in the Western world is broadly associated with slavery as the early form of colonialism. And it's in that context that something called race is created, which essentially means that certain people who are defined as non-Europeans find themselves ruled and governed by Europeans.
For people in America in the 17th and the 18th century, race was a fact of life. And I think that racism is something that comes out of that interaction of necessity. This isn't people cooking up racism in their laboratory or in their study and then going out into the world to apply it. In a sense, white people, and blacks and Indians, worked out their ideas of race in proximity with each other on the hoof.
The British don't become slave traders and slavers because they are racist. They become racist because they use slaves for great profit in the Americas and devise a set of attitudes towards black people that justifies what they've done. The real engine behind the slave system is economics. Africans are items of trade. They're things that are bought, that are sold, that are bequeathed, that are inherited. They're like other items of trade. And once you've got that established, both on the slave ships, of which there are thousands leaving British ports, and once you've got that established on the plantations, and once you've got that established as a basis for expanding British wealth, how can you argue that somehow or other the great inferiority of black people isn't built into fundamental cultural values of the British?
John Hawkins was perhaps the first English trader to actually kidnap slaves from Tagrin, which is a couple of miles from Freetown, and forcibly took slaves away from Sierra Leone. The sad thing is that this man was even made a knight. When we were in school, we read about Sir John Hawkins as if he was such a good person, he was such a righteous person, somebody who had contributed positively to, the creation of the British Empire. It was only much later that some of us learned with regret that, in fact, he was not only involved in the slave trade, but he actually captured, slaves.
He established places down the quay, down by Government Wharf, what we call Government Wharf now.
Over time it became an industry, and a lot of English traders and a lot of Sierra Leonean rulers, particularly those along the coast, became heavily involved in the slave trade. And we have, for instance, several islands off the coast of Sierra Leone that were prominent slave trading posts, like Bonds Island, for instance, where there were English force, other European South force, even Americans were very heavily involved in the slave trade from Bonds Island.
We trader come for buy. The number there, in a group iron, the number we want, he take up. He put on this fire room, open, a banana, na sudara.
And of course, we know the way they were taken, captured, tied up, chained, and thrown into the ships.
So it was a very bad experience for the slaves from the moment they were captured up to the time they reached the so-called New World.
And then those who survived and did arrive, had to be put for sale. And then when they were bought, they had to undergo all kinds of indignities.
One great woman, it could cost 2 man price. Sometimes it work for you, not the garden. Not come back, it work for you, it born picking for you. Now for that, it pay 2 times for one great woman. When the boat come collect tuna, go, no Caribbean.
At a conservative estimate, over 11 million Africans were transported across the Atlantic. Manacled and packed together like animals, at least 2 million died during the infernal voyage known as the Middle Passage.
Slaves are seen as deracinated people, people who did not belong, who were natally alienated. That is, they had no rights of birth, and they're seen as people who had been torn from another society but not socialized into the new one. So they were socially dead, so to speak. They were seen as people without honor, which is a degraded condition. The value of this for the master is that the master had absolute power over the slave, regardless of what the laws may say. They had rights of life and death.
A situation grows up where thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of these black or dark-skinned people are being kept down without rights and kept at work night and day by a system of surveillance with whips and cutlasses. And of course, there is the fear that they will try and rise up, that they'll try to run away, and that when they do that, they're going to slaughter the masters and the overseers and their wives in their beds. And really that any white person will be seen as a potential enemy by the blacks. And so you get this mutual fear between the two groups, and this tends to consolidate racial feeling. And the only way to keep these slave societies even minimally secure was to arm all the white men, and even indeed some of the white women too.
So you're there in your plantation manor, you're there in your settler outpost. What are the natives doing? Sort of classic line, from these movies. The natives are restless. What's going on? Those drums in the background. There's the idea that these people are sort of getting together and they're going to invade us, they're going to attack us. And it's a kind of projection basically. In other words, you've invaded their countries, you've subordinated them. There's a long history of colored perils. There's the red peril called Red Indians. There's the yellow peril, there's the black peril. There's this idea of the non-white other. And the non-white other is threatening, the non-white other is scary, the non-white other may be coming to attack. And it comes out of, you could say, a bad conscience in part, a sort of subconscious recognition perhaps of the kind of things that have been done to the non-white other.
In the early 16th century, from Chile in the south to Florida in the north, this non-white other was no more than vermin to be exterminated. The Dominican monk Bartolomé de las Casas was eyewitness to countless atrocities against the native populations. His account reads like a catalogue of genocide.
The mainland and the region known as Florida. The Spaniards murdered many, as is their custom, in order to strike terror into the hearts of these people. They made their lives an utter misery, treating them as so many beasts of burden. In another large town, the butchers put the whole town to the sword, young and old, chiefs and commoners, not even the children were spared. The butcher-in-chief arranged for a large number of natives in the area to have their noses, lips and chins sliced from their faces. They were then sent away in unspeakable agony and all running with blood, to act as walking testimony to the great deeds and holy miracles performed by these dauntless missionaries of the Holy Catholic faith.
The things that Las Casas witnessed, particularly on Hispaniola or in Cuba, these incredible crimes, these incredible attacks on Indians, disembowelings and burnings and rapes and whatever else, I'm sure that that level of violence is something that you could have witnessed in different places in the 17th, the 18th century, in other parts of the Spanish Empire. But it was a peculiarly awful moment that Las Casas saw as the Spanish got to the Americas and tried literally to work the Indians to death.
The reports of Las Casas caused enough unease for the Council of the Indies, the Spanish administrators of the New World, to call a debate at Valladolid in Spain in 1550. The debate concerned not just the mistreatment of Indians, but whether they could be categorized as human at all. In contest with Las Casas, the champion of the native populations, was the Jesuit Juan Ginés de Sepulveda.
By this time, the Spanish have been in the Americas for about 50 years. And during that time, the brutalities carried out by the conquistadors had reached such heights that it caused some alarm. And out of that context came this particular debate. On the one hand, there was this idea that the Indians had souls, they could be Christianized, and they should be treated not as servants, not as forced laborers, but as people under the protectorate